Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a shame I can't be with you in person, but maybe given the nature of the things that I'm going to be talking about, actually remote working makes sense and is appropriate to what we're doing. Um, as Hannah said in the introduction, my work was initiated by what the farmers in Jersey saw was happening in England, particularly in the way of new legislation, especially around air quality. And then this has then been expanded with things such as the carbon neutral strategy, which has been put forward by your government. The approach of Jersey Dairy, being proactive and engaging with ministers and with the government and regulators, is to be highly commended. It's certainly worked well in my experience in the past, and helped engender a degree of cooperation, and at the end we've ended up with a better overall result, both for the regulators, for the farmers, and most importantly for the environment that we all live and work in together as well. So I think, for success and for things for this work to be successful, we have to start thinking out of silos, and the way which particular bits of legislation tends to drive people into a silo mentality. Although what I'd like to try and get across over today is working in for the greater good and more holistically. So hopefully this will work. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the background and information. But just to start with, just like to remind people, it's all about really sustainability. There's a lot of talk about at the moment about making society and business more sustainable. So let's just remember that actually, it's not just about our needs today, but it's also we're thinking about the future generations and the ability for them to meet their needs, whatever they may be, in this rapidly changing world. So, as I said before, there's a lot of changes driving environmental legislation in the UK, and some of it you're seeing on the island of Jersey. Climate change, it's all in the news. And the weather that we've just been experiencing, I gather that you've had yet another very wet October, as we've had over here, and things, traditional ways of working, traditional thinking regarding about seasons is changing, and farmers are having to adapt, and no doubt Paul will be talking more about this. But climate change is here to stay with us, whether we believe it or not, and we have to adapt to it. Yeah. Secondly, the carbon neutral. There's a lot of ambition around carbon neutral, but we have to understand this, and where is the role of agriculture? So we'll be talking about this, but I think we'd like to show that there are challenges, but there's also opportunities there. Air quality is a really big one. In England, there's a lot of talk about it, and I know you have issues with poor air quality, especially around the towns or where there's a lot of traffic. And this is affecting public health as well as biodiversity and nature. So farmers have a role to play in improving air quality, although it's not all farmers to blame for it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then soil quality, soil health, again, another big topic, but it all fits in with sustainability. We were hearing earlier from Jim about all the good things happening on soils. And soils, we've got to think of them as a valuable resource. Otherwise, they're not going to be here, and they're not going to be functional for future generations. But also by looking after our soils, then, and which I know you're doing a lot of work towards, then actually you can improve your productivity, your outputs, which again leads to the sustainability and achieving things like carbon neutral, because we become more efficient. And then water quality. I know that's been a big focus of attention on the island. A lot of work with your nitrate regulations, for example, and a lot of work by the water company to improve the quality of its discharges. But again, that has given you a challenge because of the amount of phosphate that has been produced on the island in relation to offtake by all the various crops. So water quality is another important thing. But this is what I said, we don't want to look in silos, we want to look at the overall bigger picture. But if we just start at the beginning and we think about how do we prevent pollution, actually, it's all about linking the source and then the pathway to the receptor. So the source could be vehicles, it could be your dairy farm or fertilizers. The pathway is how that moves. So whether that's through leaching through the soil, whether it's evaporation or volatility of gases, and the receptor is then what receives it. So very typically it might, but unfortunately, be your neighbor that doesn't really appreciate some of the rural odors, or it could be things like the habitats, or even around your coastline is the sea, which is a very sensitive ecosystem, very susceptible to pollution, whether that's phosphates, soil runoff, or agricultural spills, which occasionally, very unfortunately, happen from time to time. So what we do, if we try and stop this, then we need to think about this mechanism. But actually, if we if we look at the source and see what we can reduce our impacts at source, and then think about what we can do to intercept them on the way, which could be, for example, different soil management. So what are we really talking about? Are we talking about pollutants, or are we talking resource management? Because pollutants are only resources really in the wrong place. A bit like a weed is a plant in the wrong place. Things like nitrates, phosphates only become pollutants when they're not where you can manage them and utilize them for your greater good. So if we start looking at resource management and think about how we're doing that, and then hopefully by managing our resources effectively, not having a leaky system, then we have less pollution to deal with at the end, and therefore the solutions or the regulation can be much less challenging and have less impact on your businesses if you've basically tied everything up with it. So, as I say, if we look at it, if this is looking at it from dairy farmers, but you're going to put the same approach on for arable, potatoes, you name it, really any system. But we have a whole, we have a circle, which is our system. And if we think about it, what are we trying to produce? In the case of the dairy farmers, you're trying to produce milk, and then that milk is then broken down into other commodity products which add value. The other co-product here mainly is breeding stock, calves, etc. But the prime thing that you try and produce is milk. And how do we do that? We do that with inputs, whether they're things like feed, fertilizers, or the animals. But what we're trying to do is manage our inputs. And that can also be the grass that you use for grazing, and the animals yourselves. Then we have the house system. So again, why do we house our animals in winter? Yeah, it's to actually become more efficient. They yield better, but also it gives the grass time to recover, and the whole system and the ecosystems and everything can move together. And then, and then obviously there is a co-product, and I like to call it as a co-product, not a waste, that is being produced by our cows. So we need to store that. And I know you've invested a lot in storage, and there's a lot of good practice going on there, although it is becoming challenging relating this storage and closed periods to, as I mentioned before, the climate change. So we maybe need some different ways of thinking rather than copying, for example, other people's legislation, what is appropriate to the island of Jersey, and that's what I'm going to talk a lot more about. And then following on from that, then is how do we spread it? Do we spread it when it can be utilized most effectively, but also so how we reduce our emissions, our losses. So I know an example we're showing here, a curved splash plate, which a lot of the farmers are using, which is a better low emissions technology. However, so that's what's going on in our system, and we've got our primary output, but what we come out of the system? Well, actually nitrates and ammonia, nitrogen in the manures and slurries, or being deposited on the ground by these grazing animals, is a product, and it only and it is a useful, valuable resource, as is the phosphate. which again is coming from the animal feeds that you're buying in and the home produced forages that you're producing. And these are valuable assets. However, they then become a pollutant if they are put on in excessive quantities or at the wrong time. So we need to think about, actually, are they a friend or foe? And let's keep them more on the friend side. Then there are sort of emissions to water and to the soil. And then we have atmospheric emissions. Methane, the one that dairy farmers and ruminant farmers get tired with time and time again, is methane. The challenge with methane is, as a greenhouse gas, it is sort of 26 times more polluting than carbon dioxide. So it's measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. Now, cattle, unfortunately, do tend to breathe out, and then slurries and manures produce a lot of methane, which can either be captured or unfortunately is lost as a greenhouse gas. Now, methane is a difficult one at the moment, because actually there is some research which has come up, and it's shown that methane generally is persistent in the atmosphere for about 30 years. So our methane from today's cows is actually replacing the methane which was produced by their great-grandparents or however many generations they go back. So actually what we're doing at the moment is topping up. But when we look at what's been happening in terms of efficiency, where your numbers of dairy farmers have dropped, your numbers of cows have dropped, and you're now down to around 2,500 cows, then actually, and your production efficiency's gone up, probably your whole net methane change could well be declining, but we don't know. So that's methane. So think about it importantly. Another important greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide is produced when nitrogen, or in nitrogen-rich soils that become cold, damp, and wet. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's all to do with nitrogen use efficiency. So if we don't have excessive nitrogen in the soils over winter, then, or when they're very wet, then we will have less nitrous oxide produced. I know the potato farmers have really moved a long way with precision application, and that's reduced the amount of residual nitrogen, because I know the dairy farmers are, maybe not grumbling, but have noticed that there isn't the residual nitrogen for growing the following crop of maize or whatever that there used to be. And the same is happening in England, especially as farmers have become more efficient with their way that they're feeding and their protein levels that are going into the animals. Then actually we end up with less excreted nitrogen and phosphorus. And then finally, if we talk about ammonia gas. Now, ammonia gas is coming from our livestock and from fertilizers. But this ammonia gas travels into the atmosphere, and I've stolen this image from DEFRA in England. So the figures on here are English figures, and that's what I'd just like to stress. But agriculture in England is actually responsible for 88% of the ammonia in our atmosphere. Now, some of this will be wafting across in your direction, but you're probably more likely to be getting it from a more southerly direction, because we get their ammonia as well. However, a large source of ammonia in the atmosphere comes from agriculture, because agriculture is a big use of nitrogen products, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's protein in your feed. And the impacts of nitrogen, as I said, they can be on the habitats, on biodiversity, so it can be dissolved in rainfall, and it causes enrichment, which is great on your fields, but not so good if you've got a really sensitive ecosystem of rare plants or trees or invertebrates, etc. Or what it also does, it also reacts in the atmosphere with nitrous oxides, which generally come from combustion, vehicle fuels, boilers, etc. But also it reacts with salt compounds, particularly around the coast. And this reaction of the ammonia with these compounds produces really fine particulates called PM2.5s. They can be ingested. They get into the lungs, and they're able to pass through the lung lining into the blood, and that then can cause heart disease, it can cause breathing difficulties, and where you've got people that are really affected by this badly, especially in towns and cities, then actually there can be a shortening of life as well. Hence, the costs to the UK economy are in the billions. Hence the reason our government has decided that they're going to introduce new measures to try and control them. So we ended up with our clean air strategy, which is what your Jersey dairy farmers had seen. And actually that is ongoing. It's not moved as fast as we thought because of, as the minister hinted, or deputy minister hinted, the domination of discussions about how we, with our European counterparts, but also other things that have been going on. But actually, yesterday, our government announced launched its consultation on the future of urea fertilizers. I know that's something that you don't have, but these are the measures that are coming in, and hence the concern of your farmers. What creates ammonia? Basically, it is when the urine and the feces react, you get this reaction, chemical reaction goes on, and ammonia is produced. So when the animals are in the housing or on yards, then you will get ammonia from the slurries. When they're in the field, you actually get differential deposition, so there's much less ammonia being released. So actually grazing systems are good, and one of the strategies put forward in England is actually extended grazing. With your climate, you're there, you're ticking the box. So that's all good. And then when we look at our agricultural emissions, I don't have figures particularly for Jersey, but actually if you look in England, the vast majority of them, 50%, is coming from cattle and fertilizer. Actually, this side of it, with pigs, chickens, etc., of this particular circle, we can forget in your case. However, dairy, cattle, and fertilizer are the big producers of ammonia, and it will be the same on your island, but probably your circle, it will be very much smaller than our circle. And then we look at where does that come from? Well, housing is a large part of it. Again, your housing probably a little shorter time very often than a lot of ours. Manure application is about quarter. That's in spreading slurries. And fertilizer application, that is nitrogen fertilizers, ammonium nitrate, and urea. Well, you don't have urea. But this increased in England because we were spreading more urea fertilizer. We think that's reversing this year, urea being more volatile. However, these are figures that people are taking, but if you don't look at them in context of your particular situation, then actually the people may misinterpret what is going on. So, then I was brought in to look at the effects of ammonia and clean air and what the Jersey dairy farmers were doing. However, then along came the carbon neutral strategy, and it made sense to look at the two things together. And actually, when we look at farming on Jersey, you are 4% of the GHGs. So you're right down produced. You're right down at the bottom. However, agriculture is keen to play its part. So where are the farmers of Jersey? Well, actually, as I said before, the mission changed. We're joining now ammonia and carbon neutral because you can't look at the two separately. So what we did, we visited the farms just in January to see actually where you were, because the initial visit summer 2019, actually highlighted that there is a lot of good practice going on the island. And there is a technology shift. So things like old tractors for scraping out, the systems of housing, there's adoption of new technology. For those that have not seen them, this is like a little vacuum cleaner that goes around, robotic, completely autonomous vehicle, electric vehicle. So it's an EV ticking that box. And it goes round and it sucks up the slurry and carts it back to the slurry store where it deposits it. So a very clean system, but it has benefits as well for the cows' health and well-being and the welfare of the cows. So there are a lot of synergies with a lot of positive relationships from doing things like cleaning cleaning the atmosphere, and becoming more efficient, more carbon efficient. So that's one example of things that is starting to happen, but there's a lot more going on around the place that I saw. Grazing management, carbon sequestration is a huge opportunity here, but improving that, getting more from your grass and using the grass as part of a rotation to get more from the land. So that's important. Feed use and efficiency. Diet information is being, advice is being taken and sought using professionally prepared rations which are appropriate for your cows. We have to remember that we have a lot of unique features on Jersey. We have a very long growing season, but also we have a different animal to the conventional or the ones that people generally think about, and it's a more efficient producer. The other thing that we have to think about is actually when we were listening this morning about trees and the opportunities here, you have a very much higher ratio of grassland to margins, field margins, hedges, etc., which is an opportunity there for the farmers compared to, say, in England. But you'll be hearing more from peers, I gather, on that later. Other things, water quality, providing the cows with good water, because milk is basically converted water, and if they don't take the water in, they don't take the feed in. So there's a lot of good things going on in improving water quality. Covering slurry stores, the circular stores are already covered, and the other stores are crusted. That is a real positive thing for keeping the ammonia within the slurry. So again, real good stuff going on there. Investment in new equipment. So here we have a vacuum pump, but there's milk cooling, which are large consumers of electricity, which is a carbon dioxide emission. However, there's efficiencies are going forwards on the farm. So this technology is almost universally adopted. And of course, it's just getting the uptake and carrying on and finishing the job off. And then finally, you don't think about things, but these brushes, these brushes boost the welfare of the cow. For those that haven't seen them, the cow rubs on them and they rotate and they give her a good scratch, but actually they result in a yield increase. So little things, but it's all like putting pieces of the jigsaw together to get these efficiencies. So there's a lot of good stuff happening, but what can happen? What else can go on? Where do the farmers sit? Again, looking at carbon emissions or carbon footprint, if you want to look at it from English farming, because we don't have it for Jersey, the big one is methane from the rumen. Again, I mentioned before, your cows are different, so we need to think about actually what is this figure in Jersey. Here we have carbon dioxide from our energy use for fertilizer manufacture, etc. Well, again, efficiencies, we can drive this down, and there are things happening. This one is the nitrous oxide I talked about before. It's about a quarter for UK dairy farmers. Actually, in Jersey, it's probably a lot less than this because you don't have the same climate. You have a much longer growing season. And generally, your soils are not waterlogged. They're very productive. So there's one crop after another, 2 crops a year, sucking that nitrogen out. So again, your figure here is probably different. So what I would say is actually what we need actually to know where we're starting from is a Jersey specific carbon footprint. We need to think about dairy farming as being part of the rotation, because it is. Don't look at it just as a sole activity. How does it work in synergy with potatoes, with other crops, with maize, for example, or forages, or going forwards if we've got good carbon footprint information, and then with climate change, are there opportunities to grow new crops, bring new crops in? And again, we're just hearing about markets. So are there opportunities there to broaden your product base, basically? Excuse me. Then we need to identify the improvements. We need to build resilience into our systems. And it's only by knowing where we are that we can do that. So again, I mentioned like alternative crops. And then, we need to look at what are the opportunities. What are the opportunities that farmers have to add value to what they're doing? For example, sequestration. We've heard it before, there's a lot of talk about it, but basically your land being an absorber of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, earlier this week, I was in a conference and there were figures presented where arable farms in England with large percentages of wood and hedge were actually had a negative carbon footprint because they had measured the value of the trees and the hedges. So here, as I mentioned earlier, you've got a really good ratio of trees, hedges to land. Probably if we do the sums, farming is not at 4% at all. So a big opportunity there for you to hit that carbon neutral box. So benefiting from it. Is it possible? Yes, there is, as I mentioned, carbon sequestration. Excuse me. But then there's also opportunities. Think, you've got very good sunlight. You've got a lot of ultraviolet light. I was in Colombia and the farmers there, they talk about UV measuring, and it's the same with you. Can you use this to produce either things like electricity directly? And I know there's starting to be investment in solar PV. But are there other opportunities? You have a lot of neighbours against your land. Could you use, for example, ground source heat pump technology, renting bits of your land out for the neighbours to suck the heat out to warm their water or their houses in winter, or in the summer to return that heat back into the soil? There's an opportunity there with just a little bit of lateral thinking and the right economic and social environment to do it. And then, of course, there's the potential of the marketing and the image of what you're doing, adding value to the brand. So initial improvements, soil health is an area where I think there could be attention. I know you've done a lot of work, but it needs quantifying, basically. Fertilizer and manure management, there could be some tightening up here, and the technology that Jim was showing us earlier, especially with satellite imagery, could help with that. And I was just thinking that, maybe understanding when the fields are taking up nitrogen, and particularly soil temperatures, could be used better to manage your nitrogen closed periods rather than fixed dates in a calendar. Then energy efficiency, cleaner fuels. We're talking about electricity, electric vehicles. They're starting to happen, but also we're getting hydrogen vehicles, investment in hydrogen-powered fuel cells. So those things could come, but it just needs those catalysts to make them happen. Continued investment in good housing systems. You've got a lot of good modern technology, a good bit of farm buildings, but the work just needs to carry on. And key to all of this is building and developing the skills of those that are involved in this. We heard this morning about skill levels within agriculture. Again, we need the people that understand what is coming, the challenges, and so that then they can exploit the opportunities. So in summary, there's a lot of good things already happening, but you need to measure them, quantify them, and then you can exploit them or seek further opportunities and identify where you can make improvements, and just close those any leaks from your system. Also look to exploit new opportunities. As I said, you have a unique island. Don't think of it as like the European Union member states, which is massive. We have legislation which is trying to fit from the Mediterranean right up to Scandinavia, and you're sat in the middle there. That sort of approach to legislation, in my view, doesn't provide the best fit for farmers to really optimize what they're doing and maximize the opportunities. So develop your sustainability and enhance your brand is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you very much. Just before you disappear, we've just got one question for you. What are the biggest challenges to introducing new technology which will lower the carbon footprint of farming on Jersey, would you say?
Right, I think that's a good question. I think, first of all, it's having access to those technologies. Being a very small market, are people that are selling those technologies able to invest in supporting the market, having the skills of the people, to sell the products, identify where they can be used, but then also just to maintain them, service them, and upgrade the skills of the people that are using them. You know, we have a lot now of very complicated tractors, but actually are people getting the most out of them? We heard of precision farming this morning on the arable side, but actually it's going on with the management of the cows, with cow monitors, etc., visual image technology. But again, it needs the skills. And then secondly, you need the finance and the finance mechanisms to actually basically be seed corn and to get things going. So we've seen that, for example, with the robotic scrapers and the grants. Well, perhaps the opportunities just need to be explored a bit more to expand on that.
Okay, Nigel, well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
It was a great talk. Thank you. Bye-bye.